Hello and welcome to Gefet Yael Shimoni, bringing to you together with Fadran, learning a bit of Iyun in your limud daf yomi. And we are in Perek Chelek. It's a perek of a lot of aggadita. I don't know how accustomed you are to learn so much aggadita. I enjoy learning midrash every week on the parsha, and it's a different perspective when you do such a big chunk of agada at once. And today, what we're going to do is to look at the story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which is a very interesting and famous story in the Gemara that not many people know nowadays, that the Tanakh learning is not as strong as it should be. It should be stronger, and it's a very, very important story, as you will see. And what we'll see is how the sugya here, even though it's aggadic, has a definite implication on very big and grave questions like Yalek V'Aliyavo. If you are interested, you can listen to a Gefet that I've done a few weeks ago that also dwells upon the same Tosafot that we'll see today, only from a different perspective. Okay, so let's begin. We're in Daf Tzadi Gimel Amud Aleph. We're talking about the story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Let me just sum up the story in short. It's in Sefer Daniel. Sefer Daniel is a sefer written mostly in Aramaic, which is why many people don't read it, even though once Aramaic was like English. It Dafka made the book more known to everyone. So if you haven't read Sefer Daniel, highly recommended to read it in translation into English or into Hebrew. English is as good as Hebrew in this case because it's Aramaic in its source. And to see the famous story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Interestingly, many of you might have known the story in variation in the Midrash. A famous Midrash says about Abraham that when he was young and he destroyed the Avodah Zarah of his father, that Nimrod, the king, threw him into Kibshana Esh, into the fire, and then he survived. Actually, this midrash is based on the story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that is written in Sefer Daniel. Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were young children that were captured as part of the destruction of the first temple. They and Daniel were groomed in the courtyard of Nebuchadnezzar, the king, and became important personnel of his kingdom. And Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the story goes that even though they were very, very top men in the court, they became part of a problematic situation that Nebuchadnezzar decided one day to build a huge monument of himself made out of gold and to have everybody bow down to it. And Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were there. They refused to bow down. He threw them into the fire, and then they were saved by an angel. A fourth image emerged and saved them. And then those who told that they didn't bow down to the statue were thrown into the fire and were purged. So that's the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Again, it's the base of the Midrash on Abraham. And here we see that the story is repeated many times in Gemara and Midrashim. It's very, very central, dealing with questions of Kiddush Hashem. So let's see what the Gemara says and how it builds the story and adds other layers to it and asks questions on it. Amar Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chanilai. Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chanilai, he's a famous aggadic Amora because we know him from Masechta Shabbos, the Pim of Chanukah. He's the one who says that the whole of Joseph was 20 amot down. Amar Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chanilai. בשעה שיצאו חנניה, מישאל ועזריה מכבשן האש, באו כל אומות העולם וטפחו לשונאיהם של ישראל על פניהם, אמרו להם, יש לכם אלוה כזה ואתם משתחווים לצלם? מיד פתחו ואמרו, לך אדוני הצדקה ולנו בושת הפנים כיום הזה. So Rashi here helps us understand what Rabbi Tanchum says. Rabbi Tanchum says that after Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were saved miraculously from the fire, all of the world looked at the Jews and said, how come you are working, doing Avodah Zarah when you have such a God? And הפכו לשונאיהם של ישראל על פניהם. שונאיהם של ישראל is בלשון סגי נאור. It means you have to read it the opposite way. What Rabbi Tanchum is describing is the world talking to the Jews. שונאיהם של ישראל, they're actually Israel themselves, and Rashi says here, תפכו לישראל על פניהם. And what we see here is that up till then, Avodah Zarah was something common that Am Yisrael did, but here, after this miraculous saving of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, it suddenly seems totally irrelevant and crazy to do avodah zarah when you see that God saves them from the fire. And Mishael says that's true. You're right. We really shouldn't be doing avodah zarah. How come we did it? The sugya continues. We won't read it all, but as we will see in the next part of the Gemara, Chachamim and the Gemara asks a question about Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. If Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were indeed so well known, so great, how come we don't hear about them anymore in Tanakh? And the Gemara asks, Rabbanan, le'echan azlu? Rashi explains, Rabbanan, Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, where did they disappear to? How come we never hear about them anymore? And here we have a machloket between the Amoraim, and the same machloket is in the Tanaim. What's a machloket? Three different answers to this question. Where did Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah disappear to? Amarav, b'ayin haram metu. Rashi explains, b'ayin haram metu, שהיו מסתכלים בהם על שהיו תמהים בהם. That everybody looked at Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they were saved, and actually that was a bad eye that killed them. Shmuel Amar, Barok Tavu. Shmuel says they died because they drowned in spit. This is very unpleasant and crazy, and we hear that in Aggadot sometimes that we feel that Chazal are doing something very, very extreme in the pictures to drown in spit. What is Shmuel saying here? It sounds that he agrees with Rav that they died, but the manner of death is terrible. So explains Rashi, terrible and strange. Explains Rashi, what does it mean to drown in spit? ברוק טבעו, באותו רוק שחקקו אומות העולם בישראל שאומרים, אלוה כזה יש לכם והשתחוויתם לצלם. So Rashi says, we have to go back to the passage that we read in the beginning. The whole world looked at Am Yisrael and said, how come you are avodah zarah when you have such a God? And they spit at them. The spit was so big that it drowned Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. What Shmuel is saying is actually making a point here that the story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah was a story that really made everybody understand that working avodah zarah doesn't make sense anymore because all the world thought that it was crazy. So that's how I understand Shmuel here in his explanation of what happened to Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Rav and Shmuel from Bavel, he's from Eretz Yisrael, and he says, no, the reason we don't hear about them is because they lived happily ever after. עלו לארץ ישראל, נשאו נשים, הולידו בנים ובנות. And the Gemara says that Machloket Tanaim, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua are like Rav and Shmuel, and Chachamim are like Rabbi Yochanan, that say that they actually went to Israel and they actually have a pasuk, because there's a pasuk saying, Shema na Yoshua, Kohen HaGadol, אתה ורעך יושבים לפניך, כי אנשי מופת. מה? Who's Anshe Mufet, the people who had a miracle, those are Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So what did we see up till now, and how did Rashi help us? We saw that the story of Sanhedrin actually has a point to say, that the fact that Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah did not bow down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar wasn't only a situation where Jews were Mosrim Nafsham al Kiddush Hashem. This actually changed something worldwide because this was very, very, very famous, and the whole world stopped believing in Avodah Zarah because of what Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah did. So much so that Shmuel says that they drowned it in the spit that the world was spitting on the Jews for being of the Avodah Zarah. Now let's continue to the last part of the Agada here. The Agada continues and asks, okay, Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were in the story. They did not bow down to the statue and they were thrown, and then they survived. It was a great miracle. How about Daniel? Daniel was also part of the courtyard of Nebuchadnezzar. How come he wasn't part of the story? Did he bow down to the statue? Could it be? And if not, where did he go to? So the Gemara asks, Daniel hechan azar. And here you have three answers, Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan, all of them saying that he went on some kind of errand. What kind of errand? Either to dig and to find water, or to find a certain kind of plant, or to bring a special kind of animal. all of these three answers, won't go into the depths of them, all are an agreement that Daniel wasn't there because he was sent on an errand. And then continues the Agada and says, how come Daniel was sent on this errand? Three were in the same idea, the same Eitzah, Kadosh Baruch Hu, Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. Three different, I don't know, how would I call God an entity? Two people and God were thinking the same thoughts. Kadosh Baruch Hu said, I want Daniel to be out of here. Why? Daniel was greater than Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and God wanted to give Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah the grounds to show that they were worthy enough to be saved, and that were not saved only because Daniel not bowed to the statues. That's God's point of view. Daniel said, Rashi here explained to us that Daniel became an avodah zarah in himself. In what sense? That Nebuchadnezzar showed such respect to Daniel that he started to worship him. And therefore Daniel was afraid that he would actually perish in the fire. Why? Explains Rashi. The Nebuchadnezzar עשאו אלוה, כדכתיב אל דניאל ושגיד, והביא אלי כפסילי אלוהיהם, שהמקרא הזה היה טובח עליהם משורפם, לכן היה מתיירא. Daniel knew that Nebuchadnezzar worships him, and he knows that according to the Psukim, the Tanakh, and according to halakha, if you're avodah zarah, you really have to be burned. That the reason that Daniel could perish in the fire wasn't because he was at fault, but because he was actually avodah zarah in the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar. This is a very, very interesting statement of the Gemara. We won't open it up now. Remember it maybe for future Iyun. And Nebuchadnezzar said, Nebuchadnezzar really sees Daniel as a god, and he's afraid that Daniel will perish in the fire, but then everybody will say that Nebuchadnezzar killed his god. So again, the two ends of the Braita are very interesting, but they're not our main concern. Bottom line, let's just sum it up. The Gemara here says that actually it was known that the situation will come forth. So much so that Daniel himself made sure not to be there. And he had a chance to be sent on an errand. This point will be very important when we will read Tosafot very soon and see how this sugya is a proof for Tosafot in Masechet Sanhedrin Psachim. Okay, so let's move to Masechet Psachim. Again, I spoke of it before once this year already in Sanhedrin, but let's revise it shortly. This is a very, very interesting drash that Todos Ishromi has a drash about the plague of Tzfardei, of frogs. So this is also something maybe to remember for Leila Seder. Soon we'll be dealing with the plagues. So Todos Ishromi says, he was a great Jew in Rome, and he said this drasha, "Mara'u Chananiah, Mishael ve'Azariah shemasru atmam kedushat Hashem lekivshan ha'esh." And as Todus, how come Chananiah, Mishael ve'Azariah decided not to bow down to the statue, but to be thrown into kivshan ha'esh? Very strange question, right? We'll see Tosfot will be bothered by the question of Todus, because what do you mean why? If you have to do avodah zarah or to die, you should die, right? Anyway, that's Todus's question, and his answer is even more surprising. The question is strange, so the answer is surprising. Why did they decide to be thrown into the fire? They did a kal v'chomer from the plague of frog. What's the kal v'chomer? It says on the frogs that they jumped into the fire. Where does it say that in the Torah? There's a pasuk. The pasuk says that the frogs didn't only stay in the Yeol, and not only in the field, not only in the streets, they went into the houses, into the ovens. And the ovens were hot. How do we know that the ovens were hot? Because the pasuk says that they also came into the dough. And when do you have a dough next to the oven? When the oven is hot, says Todus. Therefore, we knew that the frogs actually did Kiddush Hashem. They jumped into the fire. So Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah do a kal v'chomer. מה צפרדעים שהם מצווים על קדושת השם threw themselves into the fire אמרו שמצווים על קדושת השם על אחת כמה וכמה. If the frogs don't have a mitzvah קידוש השם and they died for God and threw themselves into the fire, so we קל וחומר are מצווים על קידוש השם, we should die also in the fire. Very, very, very strange Rasha of Todus. And Tosafot asks a question on this drasha. To understand Tosafot's question, we have to go back to Sanhedrin Daf Ayin Dalet that you've learned recently. So let's just do a quick revision. The big three, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, Shfichut Damim. We all know this halakha in Beit Netzah. They say that if you are forced to do Avodah Zarah or to die, have to die. Same about murder, same about Gilui Arayot. But when you learned the sugya, you saw that this halakha was actually in dispute between the Tanaim. Not everybody agrees that Avodah Zarah you always have to die. Who is the big cholek? Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael, says the Gemara, Rabbi Ishmael has a different set of rules. He says that if somebody forces you to do Avodah Zarah, you have to check if it's befarhesia, if it's betzibur, or if it's beyachid. If you're biyachid, what does it mean? That you don't have 10 people of Israel watching you. It doesn't have to be men, dafka, it can be 10 women. This is, here you can't women for a minyan, but if there's no minyan around you, men or women, saying you, Oved Avodah Zarah, you actually work and not die. Why? Rabbi Ishmael says, because it says in the Torah, V'chai bahem v'lo sheyamut bahem. You have to live and not to die. But, says Rabbi Ishmael, יכול אפילו בפרהסיה, תלמוד לא תחללו את שם קודשי ונקדשתי. Rabbi Ishmael says, all that is true if it's not בפרהסיה, but if it's in front of 10 of Israel, then you die. So the halakha of Chai Behem is true as long as you're not doing it בפרהסיה. So we see that Avodah Zarah is slightly different than killing and Gilui Arayot, because here, according to Rabbi Ishmael, it changes between Sinai and Pharesia. Now, it's very interesting to understand why Rabbi Ishmael thinks this. We might return to that, but let me just sum up the sugya. There's a machloket. Rabbi Ishmael thinks that Avodah Zarah in private one should transgress. According to Rabbi Eliezer and Bet Nitzan, Avodah Zarah in private you should also be killed. This is the machloket in the sugya. Now, let's go back to the sugya in Psachim and see Tosafot's question. Tosafot looks at what Todus said, that Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that threw themselves into the fire, learned this from Tzfardeim, and he asks, how could it be that they needed to learn this from the frogs? It's pure halakha. It is known halachically that everybody agrees, both Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Eliezer and Bet Nitzah are all in agreement that Avodah Zarah you have to die if it's befarhesia, and says Tosafot, וקשה, דהה בפרהסיה הווה, ומסכינן בסנהדרין ולכולי עלמא בפרהסיה חייב למסור עצמו אפילו המצווה קלה. So Tosafot says, I can't understand why they needed help from the frogs. It's simple halakha. Everybody agrees. The story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, says the Tosafot, we all know that it was not in private. It was in public. They weren't alone there. There were other people of Israel, at least 10, that saw them. בפרהסיה הווה. So here we see that Tosafot assumes that the story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah took place before Hesia. We will soon see that this is not agreed in all of the Midrashim, but this is how Tosafot reads. Where does Tosafot read this? We'll see this soon. So if this is the case, it really doesn't make any sense. If Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were forced to do Avodah Zarah before Hesia, how could it be that they were learning from the frogs? They have to die not because of the frogs. They have to die because that's halakha. So here we have two answers of the Tosafot. Rabbanit Tam's answer is surprising. Rabbanit Tam says this statue of Nebuchadnezzar wasn't Avodah Zarah. It was just a memorial, and it was just in his honor. It's as if you would bow down to a memorial anywhere in the world. It doesn't really mean you're doing Avodah Zarah, and that's why they didn't really have to die. And it was a choice for them whether they should be machmir on themselves. And as we learned, Tosafot really has a shita that you can choose to die even if you don't have to in Avodah Zarah, and this is his shita, which is not agreed with everybody. Rambam is cholik on the shita. We didn't like Rabbanit Tam's answer because it is a little far-fetched to say that when Nebuchadnezzar built this statue, it wasn't Avodah Zarah. And the Tosafot goes into it and it says it sounds so in the Psukim that it was really Avodah Zarah. So we have to find a different answer. And we uses our sugya and Sanhedrin Tzaddik to answer this same problem. Let's see what he says. רי מפרש. מה ראו שלא ברחו? שהרי קודם המעשה היו יכולים לברוח, כמו שעשה דניאל, כדאמר בחלק, ג' היו באותה עצה. Reread our sugya, and he saw in the sugya an answer to a different question, a halakhic question. How come Chananiah, Mishael and Azariah didn't have to die? Says the you have to understand, they had a choice. They could have escaped. How do we know that? Because Daniel escaped. That's our Gemara. Our Gemara asks, how come Daniel wasn't there? Well, it's because he was sent on an errand. And then the question remains, so if he was sent on an errand, why Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah chose to remain there and risk their life instead of running away also? Says that's why? Because they learned that from the frogs. That's what they learned from the frogs. And even if you can escape, you can choose to remain and be Mekadesh Shamayim. And the reason agreement with Rabbanit Yael that you can actually be machmir and kill yourself even if you don't have to. Again, the Rambam is a big halakhic on this shita of Tosafot. In any rate, we see that the read our sugya, our aggadic sugya, and used it as a teirutz for a different kushia, which is a real halakhic kushia, or another aggadic kushia in Psachim. So what we saw up till now is how our agada is actually a player in the questions of Kiddush Hashem. I want to show you that our agada has another variation of it in Bereshit, in the Shira Shirim Rabbah. And then we have a very interesting machloket between Rabbanan and Rashbi. And they're cholkim on the question whether or not the story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah was befar Hesia. We saw that Tosafot took it as a given. The Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were viewed by other 10 Jews. But actually, this is a machloket in the Midrash. But it seems that the Tosafot understood that our Gemara thought this. Okay, so let's see the machloket here. The Shira Shirim Rabbah, it starts with a question: when did Yetzer Avodah Zarah cease to exist? We know that in Tanakh, the Jews kept of their Avodah Zarah. They were doing Avodah Zarah, and in our day and age, it seems very strange. Why did they want to do Avodah Zarah? It seems to us to be something very, very foreign. So the Gemara says, we also feel that it's foreign, the Midrash says, but there was a change in history. So it was a point that the world itself changed from believing in Avodah Zarah to stop believing in Avodah Zarah. When did this occur? So here we have a machloket. According to Rabbi Benaya, it happened in the time of Purim, where the Chayves there were the ones who made the world understand that God is really the only God, and it makes no sense to be over Avodah Zarah. Rabbanim think that that's what happened in Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's time. In Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's time, people didn't believe anymore in Avodah Zarah, and their Avodah Zarah was actually of a different man. This machloket continues in the Midrash, and there's a machloket between Rabbanan and Rashbi. What happened that caused Am Yisrael to be in the Gzera of Haman? It's a very good question. It's also a question in Masechet Megillah. We'll see soon a similar Gemara that refers to this Midrash. The Midrash asks, we just read the Megillah, right? We saw that there was a horrible Gezerah on Am Yisrael that Haman brought forth. Why? What did Am Yisrael do that they had to be in this Gezerah? And the machloket between Rabbanan and Rashbi. According to Rabbanan, it is because Am Yisrael worshipped Avodat Kochavim. And according to Rabbi Shimon, it's because they ate from the Suda of Achashverosh. And here, Rabbanan and Rashbi are debating who's right. And Rabbanan asks Rashbi, how come you're saying they were at fault because they ate from Achashverosh's Suda? אמרו לו, והלא לא אכלו סעודה אלא אנשי שושן הבירה בלבד. The only people who ate from the Suda that was problematic were people in Shushan. So how come all of Am Yisrael were Chayav Klaya because only people in Shushan ate from a problematic Suda? Rashbi says it's because Am Yisrael are Revim Zebazeh, but Chachamim have a point. Rabbi Shimon asks Chachamim, you're saying that the reason that we're Chayav in the Gzera of Aman, it's because we were of the Avodah Zarah, we were worshipping Avodah Zarah. But if that's true, we really should have died. We should have perished, because if somebody is working Avodah Zarah, he should die. אמר לו, אם כדעתכם, אתם חייבתם את כל ישראל כליה, כדכתיב זובח לאלוהים יחרם. That's a very good question that Rashbi asks. Their answer is fascinating. אמרו לו, אף על פי כן לא עבדו אותה בכל ליבה, שנאמר כי לא ינם בליבו. אף על פי כן, והוגה בני איש. תמיד עליהם אדם קשה ביותר לנסותם נבוכדנצר, ועמד והגה את מכתם. So, what's their answer? They say, no, the reason that they were not chayav mita is because they didn't really believe in avodah zarah. Lo avdu ota bechol libam. It wasn't worshiping with all their heart. They weren't really, really, really into it. They were doing it half-heartedly, and that's why they didn't have to die. They only had the gezerah that actually did not take place. And finishes the midrash and says, sums up, על דעת רבנן עבדו ישראל עבודת כוכבים בימי נבוכדנצר. על דעת רבי שמעון בר יוחאי לא עבדו ישראל עבודת כוכבים בימי נבוכדנצר. The midrash says it's a machloket whether or not Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah was a story that was actually a story of avodah zarah. Why? על דעת רבנן עבדו ישראל עבודת כוכבים. According to Rabbanan, Am Yisrael did actually worship a different God, not wholeheartedly, but that's what happened. Why? כיצד נבוכדנצר העמיד צלם, הפריש 23 מכל אומה ו23 מכל ישראל. According to Chachamim, the story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah was בפרהסיה, and actually the rest of Am Yisrael that were there, the other 10 people, did actually worship. Why? Because how did Nebuchadnezzar do this scam? What was the situation? Nebuchadnezzar took 23 people from each country, from each people that he was head of. So he took 23 Jews. Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 3 that did not bow down, but the other 20 did. So therefore, according to Chachamim, there was worshiping Befarhesia, which is actually how our Gemara read it and how Tosafot read it. We see that Tosafot read like that Chachamim in the Midrash. But according to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, says the Midrash, לא עבדו ישראל עבודת כוכבים. הכיצד? נבוכדנצר העמיד צלם והפריש מכל אומה ואומה 3 ו3 מכל ישראל. According to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, there wasn't a sin of avodah zarah at all. Why? Because it was betzin'ah, and it sounds that according to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, he thinks like Rabbi Yishmael, that if there is avodah zarah betzin'ah, and you don't do it wholeheartedly, and there weren't other people who were worshiping, so Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah didn't kill themselves. They threw themselves to be killed, so they were not Oved Avodah Zarah, and there was nobody else who actually was Oved Avodah Zarah. So here we have a machloket, what actually happened, and we understand that the Tosafot and our Gemara and Sanhedrin sounds like they think that there was actually an Avodah Zarah befarhesia there. It's true, Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah didn't worship, but there were other 10 people of Israel that actually did worship the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And now we can understand a Gemara in Megillah very well. The Gemara in Megillah, which is a Gemara that we like very much here in the Yeshivat Drisha, is the Midrash, but reversed in the people who are talking. שאלו תלמידיו את רבי שמעון בן יוחאי, מפני מה נתחרו שונאיהם של ישראל שבאותו הדור כליה? אמר להם, אמרו אתם. אמרו לו, מפני שנהנו מצודתו של אותה רשע. אמר להם, אם כן בשושן יערבו, שכל העולם כולו אל יערבו. אמרו לו, אמור אתה. אמר להם, לפני שהשתחוו לצלם. אמרו לו, וכי משוא פנים יש בדבר. אמר להם, הם לא עשו אלא לפנים, אף הקדוש ברוך הוא לא עשה עמהם אלא לפנים, והיינו לכתיב כי לא עינה בליבו, מליבו. So here in the Gemara Megillah, it's the same talk, only Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai switch places. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai phrases this idea in a beautiful manner. He says, do you know why in Purim God made us almost die, but then nothing happened? It is because we were of the avodah zarah with not our hearts. We were of the avodah zarah beki'ilu. We didn't do it wholeheartedly. We didn't really mean to be of the avodah zarah. It was just fake. It was just kidding. It wasn't real. We weren't real of the avodah zarah. So what did God do? How did God punish us? He said, I'll kill you, not for real. We didn't die in the end. We had the terrible scare. It was horrible. But bottom line, Am Yisrael survived. So why did God punish us that way? Because we said, oh, we're doing Avodah Zarah not wholeheartedly. So he killed us not wholeheartedly. It's beki'ilu and beki'ilu, lefanim velefanim. So I want to sum up what we did with this aggadic. Aggadic is always very interesting, but beyond its interest, it's very interesting to see how it connects to other areas in the Torah. First, we went to the Gemara in Sachim, and we saw how we learned from the sugya that Chananiah, Mishael and Azariah didn't have to die; they could escape, and that's very important for him because he tries to understand why Todusi Shlomi said that they learned that from the frogs. And we also saw that Rabbi Ishmael, we repeated what we learned in the Sanhedrin Ayin Daled. He thought that if you're forced to be Oved Avodah Zarah and you're in private, you don't have to die. And the B thinks that the story of Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah wasn't in private. It was Befar Hesia. And that issue is actually in the Machloket in the Midrash, whether or not the situation was a situation Befar Hesia or a situation Beprati. And we see how these agadot are actually showing this big Machloket in the background. And we also finished by learning another thing about Purim, that according to that Midrash and according to the Midrash and Masechet Megillah, the reason that Am Yisrael was chayav is because they understand that actually there were people who worshiped. It was Bifar Hesia, like the day of Tosafot, and what it sounds like also in our Gemara here. But even if they did worship, it wasn't wholeheartedly, and that's why God punished us with the Gezerah of Haman that did not actually take place, and it was totally Mida Keneged Mida. Okay, I hope you saw how reading Agada doesn't mean we just skim through it and forget about it. There's a lot to do with Agada, so we did one example. B'ezrat Hashem, next week we'll give you another take from different perspective on how Agadot interplay in other issues. And I hope you enjoy this special learning of a big perek of Agadah that will add B'ezrat Hashem a lot to your knowledge and understanding of other sugyot in Shas and in Midrash and in Machshava, B'ezrat Hashem. So take care and we will meet again soon.